You're listening to the American edition of The Voice of Russia. I'm Ric Young in Washington. What is the state of capitalism? Why has this economic system become the preferred system for the super rich? Is capitalism a bad word, and can it work for the middle class? My guest today, Ed Qualls. He's the author of the book Community Capitalism. And Ed, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Rick.
First of all, the one reason I was attracted to this book was that I like the title, Community Capitalism. I haven't heard that before.
It's rare. The problem is that the main thrust of capitalism has largely been attempts to use it for I don't want to say the ultra rich, but the people who owned the means of production, to get a little bit too much into the Marxist lingo.
That's okay.
The condition that I've seen is that people largely consider capitalism to be somebody else's system. The working people don't realize that they are actually involved in it, and they are probably the most important part of capitalism, because, as I state in the book, all business success comes from the bottom up. All business failures come from the top down.
Which is logical, because obviously business managers are the ones that are conducting the business. They're managing it. If they screw up, obviously people suffer, right? Right.
It's been interesting to watch a program, I've forgotten what station it was on, called Undercover Boss or something like that.
Oh, yes, that was the CBS production, Undercover Boss, right.
And to watch these CEOs have the sudden realization that their workers actually have knowledge of their tasks, that their knowledge, their enthusiasm, their ability to connect with the customers is so important and is such a huge resource that, unfortunately, because of the mechanisms that are in place now, that have largely been put in place in the past 35 years, the benefits provided by the workers themselves are largely ignored. The workers are thought of too much in a spreadsheet kind of way as expenses.
Well, let's go back a little bit in your book, because I want to say basically, let's deal with just the definition of capitalism.
Uh-huh.
What is capitalism?
Traditionally, capitalism is defined as a situation in which private individuals own the means of industrial production and of commerce.
Okay. Now you talk about greed capitalism. How is that different from the basic definition of capitalism?
Greed capitalism is a situation in which largely the financial side of the workings of capitalism has come to dominate the workings of commerce itself. When a system goes from concentration on goods and services merely to pushing cash around, that's when you get into greed capitalism.
So you're obviously referring to what happened in the crash of 2008.
Exactly. The biggest differences I can point, or the biggest set of differences I can point to, are those between our bailout of the automobile industry and our bailout of the banks.
What's the difference?
When we bailed out the automobile industry, we were dealing with industries that produce products, goods and services, that are actively involved in the the trade of capitalism, the actual commerce. And what happened with that was they got back on their feet. We were able to sell their stock at a profit, and we got out of that. They're restored. They're actually doing better in many ways than they have in several years. And it all came to what has really turned out as a good situation. On the other hand, when the Bush administration bailed out the banks, there was no condition for, how should I say it?
Performance?
Exactly. There was no key to tying it back into how good the actual economy itself did. So what happened? The banks took the money and put it back up into what is commonly known as the shadow economy, this world of financial instruments that passes between banks and hedge funds and offshore corporations and exists in a world of its own. And we never saw it. It was never used to engender any further development of commerce, of goods and services. It was merely used as, no other word for it, derivative gambling.
Right.
Unfortunately, the situation in those conditions are that the ones involved will take all of the profit they can from these derivative instruments, but the moment they fail, they come back to the taxpayer. So, we're sorry, we kind of lost our bet. Can you help us out? So, with this doctrine of too big to fail, the taxpayer gets stuffed with the bill.
Okay, let's turn back a little bit because you mentioned a couple of things, financial instruments known as derivatives. What are they? They seem, to the average person, rather mysterious financial instruments.
Right. That's why in the book, I spend some time trying to explain these different parts of the economy that I'm going into before actually going into the problems I see. Derivatives are financial instruments that are based on other financial instruments. Their value is derived from another financial instrument. The way that we learned about these from the crisis in 2008 was the derivatives that were based on mortgages. Now, a mortgage is a financial instrument. It is attached to real property. So it's a primary financial instrument. What the banks and the holders of the mortgages did was organize them by perceived risk, generate new financial instruments that were linked to the mortgages, and then they sold these derived instruments. Now, this is exactly the same thing that happened with the Greek situation with what's called the sovereign debt crisis in Europe.
So again, we're talking profits derived from another financial instrument as opposed to something actually produced and sold.
Right. The problem in particular with these derivatives from mortgages is that the farther you get from the actual asset involved, the harder it is to track, the more complicated the math becomes, and unfortunately, because of the way derivatives are designed, because of the way they're implemented, the situation is one in which a person or a bank that wants to sell a derivative goes to a set of banks. There are about 12 of them that are in control of the market, and they say, I want to sell these derivatives. Well, the intermediary bank will say, okay, well, come back to us. We'll talk to you later. So they take the forms and they go through their card file, their Rolodex, and they try to find a buyer for it. So they go to the buyer and say, well, we've got these instruments here that are available for sale. Would you like to buy them? So they shop them around, and then when they sell them, the intermediary goes back to the seller and says, okay, here's what we got and here's what we're going to charge you. Now, in contrast to the way a real mortgage is done, the seller and the buyer have no idea who each other is. They never talk. They never know exactly how much the other one is into the contract for. Now, this is called over-the-counter derivative marketing, and it's the market in which essentially all derivatives that are not traded on commodities exchanges, like the ones in Chicago, all of those that are not commodity exchanged, this is the way they work. No one knows who the other one is. And this is a situation in which we end up with a lack of fiduciary chain. We don't know who's responsible for each of these instruments. And it gets cloudier and cloudier the farther it moves into this repeated cycle of these instruments, we can securitize the risk on these, and then we can sell securities that only hold the risk on these derivatives.
Okay, but when you talk about these derivatives in that way, it appears that every time these derivative packages are sold, and this is my terminology, it becomes thinner and thinner, right? There's just not much there anymore. Is that it?
Yes. The only thing that's there is the deal and an estimate of the value. Now, the problem with this is the last figures I think I saw, the face value placed on derivatives just in the United States, and I believe this was 2010, was $715 trillion.
I've heard that figure before. 715 trillion with a T.
Yeah, correct, which is more than all of the economic activity of the entire world combined.
So with this derivative market being so obviously huge, what are we going to see next with this this instrument?
The problem is what arises, it's termed financial contagion, where there was one three-letter insurance company that got itself into really bad trouble because it had created derivatives that it had sold, and then it had bought derivatives that had been derived from the risk that another company had derived from the instruments it had bought from this company.
So let me ask you this. But
without knowing it, they had gotten into a cycle, a circle of derivative dependencies.
Right.
Where if there was anything that happened with the credit risk on one of these instruments, they were in trouble not only for the risk, but for the actual originating derivative.
It's a domino effect.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Ed, hold on a second. I want to get more into this situation and also more into some of the solutions you talk about in your book, but also where we are regarding capitalism. So we're talking with Ed Qualls. He is the author of Community Capitalism, and he's talking about pulling capitalism back from its own abyss. We'll be right back. You're listening to the American edition of The Voice of Russia. I'm Ric Young in Washington. On the line from Texas, we have with us author Ed Qualls. He is the author of Community Capitalism, and he's in the subtitle is Pulling Capitalism Back from Its Own Abyss. Now, Ed has a Master's of Science degree in Business Administration with graduate business studies at two different universities. Also, 30 years of success in the software engineering industry. And we're talking about some of the very strange instruments that many U.S. banks and investment houses have used to make money, but obviously it doesn't filter down to the middle class. Why not?
Largely because they continue to put it back up into that market. The danger that we face from derivatives is largely because of the involvement of the banks. It, as we've seen, is a threat to the liquidity that the banks hold. If there were no connection to commercial banking, the effects of this derivative-style gambling would largely be confined to those specific individuals and organizations that are involved in it. But unfortunately, it is a system problem in that it actually pulls money from the investments that could be made in education, highway upgrades and repairs, the things that we need for root capitalism, which is the production of goods and services, the things that small businesses are absolutely the best at producing.
Okay, but let's go back a little bit and just look at derivatives as a moneymaker. I mean, obviously they make money for somebody. Who makes the money off these?
The people that, or the banks that are involved in it, make money one from the other. There's a problem in that we're dealing with monetary figures that come in two flavors, as it were. One is the valuation that is put on a derivative. This is done as an estimate of the value of the derivative when it comes to term. Or it's a number that is plugged into a formula that makes the numbers inside the derivative work.
But to my knowledge, though, counties, states, and other public institutions haven't invested in these derivatives, right? Because they think possibly they can make certainly lots of money there, right?
There have been some that tried it. The biggest case of this was the situation with Orange County. The controller of Orange County back in the late 90s, I believe it was playing with interest rate derivatives and, was essentially betting that interest rates would be rising and would keep rising. The moment they fell, everything came due, and the county was essentially wiped out.
Basically broke.
Yeah. One of the problems with derivatives is that they are also used in hedging. Anytime you hear the word hedging in a financial situation, it's a case in which somebody has made a bet on one thing, but they want to protect themselves from loss. So they will also place a bet on the opposite situation. Now, if one looks at this with a degree of common sense, one can see that if you place a bet on each end of a seesaw, if it's going to work, the seesaw will stay level and you're not going to make anything.
But if it goes up or down? then you make money.
If one end goes down, you're making money on one side, but you're losing it on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So your gain on one side is wiped out by your loss on the other side. The best, a purely hedged situation, the best you can expect out of that is potentially to match inflation.
So how does this apply to the average person, the middle class, those who are struggling nowadays because of the crash in 2008?
It affects them because, it produces two problems. One is it pulls real money out of the working economy and into the financial economy. So you do not have credit lines being given to, particularly to small businesses, to get them going and really to get capitalism back on its feet. The other problem is that, as I mentioned, any of the losses that happen, those end up coming down and actually taking real money to satisfy. As long as the situation is positive, people will leave their money in the financial cloud, in the shadow market, and things will move back and forth between pockets, and nobody will notice. The situation is truly bad because of the involvement of banks. The fact that banks must deal both in real CIF dollars, cash in fist, and must deal in derivative dollars means that they're pulled both ways.
So in the quest for profits, banks are playing both markets, obviously one real, one, as you put it, shadowy, a shadow market. And if the shadow market tanks, then the real money, which is what we invest in, goes over there to make sure that the people are paid off, correct?
Correct.
So what do you think right now is the way to go? Because we know for a fact that nobody went to jail over the 2008 crash. We also know that back then there weren't regulations or tough enough regulations to monitor the derivative markets and these other exotic betting financial instruments that were out there. Is it still that way now, or are there at least some form of monitoring or control that prevents us from going back to the situation we were in 2008?
There really is nothing that prevents us from going back.
Why not?
Largely because no one's telling them not to. The legislation that's been enacted has been supervisory. This condition started in January 20th, 1981, when the Reagan administration had the Glass-Steagall Act, the Banking Act of 1933, essentially repealed. What had happened in the enactment of this bill in 1933 was an attempt to keep the things that caused the Great Depression from happening again, which was, just prior to this being enacted, the banks could get involved in stock transactions and other things that were highly speculative. This is exactly the root of the crash that set off the Great Depression.
In 1929.
What had happened was all of this stock had been bought on margin. The banks had loaned the money to buy stock, and the stock was valued at a certain price. When the price dropped below the origination of that loan, or the price at that origination, the bank said, hey, you need to put some money in the account or to cover us. When everyone started trying to sell stock, and the market crashed because it was flooded with sales, but nobody was buying. There was no way for these people who had bought stock on margin to cover the loan to the bank. The banks were suddenly faced with the fact that they would never get that money back. And this is exactly why President Roosevelt had the banks closed for 3 days, because if he hadn't done that, there would have been a panic on every bank in the country.
Which means
people lined up in the street
right,
to get their money back.
They would have actually demanded their money out of the banks, pulling all the money out of the system, which, of course, would further crash the system.
Right. What happened with the crisis resulting from the 2008 scenario, excuse me, was that the Fed stepped in and guaranteed the liquidity. So there were no bank runs. The situation back in 29 was that we had a very conservative Federal Reserve, and they refused to extend credit to the banks. They refused to keep the liquidity there, and it actually came to a situation where the president had to get an act of Congress to close the banks to send the liquidity out essentially himself, to go beyond what the Federal Reserve at that time would do. Luckily, we have a much more enlightened Federal Reserve now. That having been said, we also have a handicapped Federal Reserve, because all of these derivative transactions, seeing that they are taking place in the shadow economy, the Federal Reserve has little to no idea about what's going on up there, because that's beyond the venue of any central banker. It's one of the reasons why the problem with LIBOR is significant, is in that the activities of the companies or the banks and others who used the LIBOR figures for valuing loans and derivatives, none of this activity has been reported to the central bankers of any of the countries involved.
And by the way, LIBOR is a London interbank rate, correct?
Right, the London interbank offering rate. The problem with LIBOR is that the financial instruments that are valued or have been valued using that are now approaching $500 billion. Now that's a 1 with 15 zeros after it.
Right. So where are we at then when you talk about these very murky, shadowy investments with so many zeros behind it? Where are we at?
Well, we don't know for certain, but we do hope we know.
What do you mean by that?
Because it's the shadow economy.
Well, then who knows? I mean, if we don't know, the Fed doesn't know, the government really doesn't know, who really knows?
Well, we hope that the bankers involved are coming to their senses well enough that they will start pulling back from this untenable situation. What I'm trying to say, I make several suggestions. And for this, I actually have an alternate situation or an alternate suggestion. One is we just restore all the provisions of the Glass-Steagall Act from 1933.
Okay, that sounds good.
Banks just cannot engage in speculative activity.
So basically, let's keep banks doing what they do best, which is loaning money to people to buy homes, savings, checking, the basic things, right?
Right. In other words, turn banks back into banks.
And that's the bank that we know, at our shopping mall around the corner. We're not talking about the big investment banks, the usual Goldman Sachs, those. We're talking about our local banks, our community banks, right?
Right. We're talking about any of the banks that we've got our car loans or our mortgages or any of those loans from, the people that we go talk to when we have a change we need to make in our demand deposit situation. It's our neighborhood guys. And one of the things I say about banks is that in any person's life, there are three really important decisions they have to make. The first is choice of life partner. The second is choice of job, profession. And the third is choice of bank, because it's the financial, economic, what is the word I want? It's not just the resources, but it's the facilitation that banks are capable of when they are fully involved in their communities that is vital to our lives as individuals, as employees, as citizens. And the fourth, if you get that far, is probably your choice of accountant. But that's how important banks are.
So,
what I have seen,
but we haven't, we really haven't seen that the movement, especially at the government level, whether it's Congress, the president, to get the Glass-Steagall Act back into to bring it back, to make sure that banks are truly monitored. They're not in the speculative market. Why haven't we seen it, especially after 2008?
Actually, I've forgotten. I don't want to name any names, but one of the main movers and shakers in what turned out to be merger mania amongst the banks has now stepped forward to say we've gone too far. And he is actually saying that we need to bring back at least part of the regulations of the Glass-Steagall Act. We need to decentralize these banks. The problem that feeds into this is that ever since the Reagan administration, our economy, particularly in the United States, but it's also infected some of the European economies, is we have been in merger mania. And with the banks in particular, we have gone from around 50 larger, mainly regional banks,
right,
to a dozen or fewer.
Super banks.
Super banks.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, Ed, we've got to take a break. Let's deal more with that, but also let's deal with why we're not hearing from the Fed about merger mania with the banks, where the Fed is in all this. Obviously, they control the money supply. Question is, why aren't they behind getting this problem under control? We'll be right back. You're listening to the American edition of The Voice of Russia. I'm Ric Young in Washington. On the line from Texas, we have with us the author of Community Capitalism. That's Ed Qualls. He is also has a Master's of Science degree in Business Administration and 30 years of success in the software engineering industry. And we're talking about the state of our economy, why he's written the book Community Capitalism, and we're now talking about why the Fed, why Ben Bernanke has not been more vocal about these mega mergers of the banks that we've talked about this past 40 minutes. Why hasn't the Fed been more involved in getting more regulation of these super banks?
The first problem is primarily concerned with the fact that the Fed really must be apolitical. They know that there's this tug of war between the Democrats and the Republicans about full regulation versus economic anarchy, and they're trying to walk a solid line between the two. their point of view is these are the banks that we have to deal with now. This is our situation now. Let's concentrate on it and get us through 1 month at a time. I believe also that they realize that because of the derivative situation, the financial part of the economy is a little fragile. So moving slowly, moving wisely, and avoiding great shocks to the system will be the best way to move things right now. If we did bring the Glass-Steagall Act back in, we would still need a period at which the mega banks would be allowed to unroll the situations that they are in. This is purely required in order not to shock the economy.
And if there was a shock to the economy, what would happen?
I'm afraid it would be bad news.
Worse than 2008.
Yeah.
So
it's
again,
one reason why I'm very, very worried about the Republicans coming back in with their gung-ho, let's rip everything out to the walls way they want to essentially set the clock back to 1927. The point of view that they have is not well-founded.
Well, as you know, and everyone might be listening right now knows, from the Democratic side, they want more regulation on Wall Street. They want it monitored. They want the shadow markets, the gambling that goes on between banks. They want it either curtailed or stopped. Republicans say no, less regulation. Let the free market do what it does. Which one, right, in your opinion, will bring us to the brink, if not over?
The Republican point of view.
Because go ahead.
Because the derivative market is driven by greed. It is not driven by a viewpoint that is one of encouraging the middling people. The common citizen, it does no good whatsoever for. The point of view of getting some regulation in place, getting some oversight in place, what I would add to that is we need to establish the chain of fiduciary responsibility. In other words, get the shadow economy not only fully into the light, but require that each derivative be signed off by, for lack of a better term, a financial engineer. Unfortunately, we're at the point that the formulas that are embedded in these derivative contracts some of them are being written by people who have training as nuclear engineers, as physicists, as astrophysicists. The complexity of the instruments is far beyond any blueprint that you would ever imagine.
Well, let me stop you there, because what I've seen in some cases with derivatives and these exotic instruments, they're basically very complex and dense mathematical equations, right?
Right.
And that's why people with a science background are dealing with financial equations.
Right. It sometimes takes someone beyond a PhD in mathematics even to follow the logic behind the derivatives. And that's why my position, if we're not going to outlaw them completely, we have to have this chain of fiduciary responsibility, much like that we see in architecture, civil engineering, architectural engineering, where an architect comes up with a design, the civil engineer goes through it and says, yes, I've checked it, this is good, and signs it. Then it goes to the architectural engineer, and they go through and say, yeah, okay, it's not going to fall apart in the next earthquake, and they sign off on it. This personal responsibility chain is what is completely lacking in these.
Well, as many have called it, it's transparency. It's simply lacking transparency. So, but in other words, for us to understand, for even very intelligent people like yourself, to understand these mathematical equations, if it's so complex, so dense, and it takes someone beyond a PhD in physics to understand, even track them, does this mean this is a con?
I believe the person on the street would very likely see it that way.
But if it's so complex, so dense, only a few truly understand it, and the majority don't, then obviously there's inside information on this.
There could very well be, yes.
I'm not saying that you know this for sure. No, I'm just putting it out there. I'm asking the question. But let's talk about too. You've got some solutions here. We've only got about 12 minutes left. What are your solutions to this? And again, I like the title of your book, Community Capitalism. That to me that means capitalism for me, for you, for the average person.
Right. I cover several issues, and I have suggestions for the reader to think about and potentially to use in empowering their own drive for a betterment of the system. The solutions really vary depending on what you're talking about. With derivatives, it really needs to be a situation, like you say, where it's completely transparent. These need to be brought into a situation in which the Fed can understand what's going on. The first part of the book, in order to explain things to the reader that, the further issues that are covered in the book, I explain what money is and how it's created in a Western industrial nation. The problem that most people don't understand is that the Fed does not create the entire money supply. The Fed merely gets the ball rolling. It's actually the commercial banking system that creates the majority of the money supply. So what happens in these deals, in this opaqueness of the shadow market, is that because commercial banks are involved, when they make loans, that creates more money. That expands the money supply. But because it's hidden, the Fed knows nothing about it.
So it's out of sight.
Right. It is a situation that just begs for a fix, because so much is hidden that impacts every person. In the normal working of the creation of money, when the Fed injects $1 into the system, the commercial banking system creates another $6 through loans, because we have something called a fractional reserve banking system. When the dollar that the Fed puts into the system goes in, the banks look at that dollar and say, okay, I have to keep 15% of that here in case somebody comes in and cashes a check, but the other 85% I can loan. So they lend it out, and then it comes back in. You've got the 15% of that, and it comes back in again. Well, by the time it goes through that cycle enough times, it's another $6. So the same thing can happen in the shadow market without anybody knowing it. And at the same time, when the banks pull that money in, the money supply shrinks. So if they're holding more of the cash that comes in, or the dollars that come in, even if they're derivative dollars, that means that that part of the money supply has shrunk, and the Fed doesn't know about it.
So then again, we need obviously transparency, but also we need to have banks reporting to the Fed their involvement in the shadow market.
It's all a case of making this shadow market completely transparent. It's not a surprise that the Republicans are moving to keep it, if not as opaque, to make it even more opaque, because their candidate actually got most of his, or a big part of his fortune, from offshore derivatives transactions.
So basically, then you're saying the solution here is what many on Capitol have been saying, at least on the Democratic side: transparency in the shadowy market, some regulations prohibiting our regular banks from getting involved in these exotic financial instruments and investments, and sort of bringing banks back home.
Right. It's a case where we need our good old neighborhood banker. Now, most of the people in the U.S., in fact, in the world, don't realize that for the longest period in the history of the state of Texas, banks had to be they had to be chartered by an act of the legislature, and even in that case, they could be owned only by individuals or by limited partnerships. So you could not have a bank corporation in Texas, and this existed up until, I believe, the 1960s. And the reason for that was that all of the ranchers and farmers and merchants, they all wanted to know their banker. They wanted to have a personal relationship with that banker. And that was what the prosperity of the state of Texas was founded on, was a personal relationship with the people who were involved in your financial health.
And we don't have that anymore.
No. There are situations in which you can find local financial institutions. They may be banks, they may be called by another name. There are actually branches of the big banks in which you can find employees who will bend over backwards to help you. So the big banks have the opportunity to be the true and dedicated partners of community capitalism, the capitalism of the people, of the small businesses, of the small farmers, of the everyday hoi polloi. They have that opportunity.
Are credit unions doing that?
Some credit unions are doing that, yes.
Are those small regional or community banks doing that kind of thing you're talking about?
There are quite a few that are doing that too, yes. One of the interesting things that is starting to come in is that as the American people realize what's going on with the mega banks, and they get so upset with the fact that they've taken the money and we don't know where it is and it's not coming back to help us, they are moving their financial dealings to the smaller banks. We even have some smaller regional banks that are coming up now because they find they can have a personal banker.
Well, do you find it interesting that from the right side of the political spectrum, the Republicans are always talking about big government, but they never talk about big banking?
Yes.
Interesting.
It's one of the things that bothers me most, because you will always hear the people on the right say, "Well, we don't need big government. We need small government," and that's a phrase that means nothing. What I think they would agree that they mean, if one could get a word in edgewise, is that what we need is not to set out to have smaller government. What we need is effective, efficient, and frugal government. If those are put into place, government will necessarily, or not necessarily, but it will, from those goals, shrink. It's not a case of just lopping off government.
But also, I think implicit in what you're saying is if the private sector, including the banking system, self-managed, self-regulated, and self-governed itself, then you wouldn't need the government managing and governing and regulating this industry, correct?
Right. That's the problem with laissez-faire capitalism, is that it is wide open for all sorts of abuse because no one is in there to say, you really shouldn't be doing that.
And with globalization, of course, this is even a bigger problem. All of our economies are intertwined. They're related, right?
Exactly.
We got about 2 minutes left, and I want to get some information in before we close. Your website is what?
It's www.communitycapitalism.us.com.
And that's where we can find your book.
That's where the book is. It's also available on Amazon.com. But if you go to the website and click on the front cover image, it'll take you to the Amazon link. There's a shorter URL that will get you there that is www.communitycapitalism.eu. And
also, your book is not a heavy-duty intellectual read. It's for the average person to understand just how our system works, right?
It's a try to empower the person on the street to understand what's going on, the things that they know that they are so frustrated about.
Okay.
But this frustration cannot be expressed by them because of fear of losing their jobs.
Well, that's something we have to talk about again. You know, this has been an hour talking with you, and I've barely scratched the surface on some of the things that you've brought up in your book. And again, I got to have you back on, Ed. It'll be soon because this is election year. We need to talk about some of these things. Again, we've been talking with Ed Qualls. He's the author of Community Capitalism. Ed, thanks for joining us. Have a good day. We'll have you back.
All right. Thank you.